Professor Oliver Hart, welcome to Nobel Week in Stockholm. All Nobel laureates are asked to bring a thing, an artifact that is special to him or her, to the Nobel Museum here in Stockholm. What did you bring, Mr. Oliver Hart?
Well, my book, the one book I've written myself. As explanation, let me say, unlike some scientists, or physicists, chemists, biologists, or even some economists who do lots of empirical work, as a theorist, I don't have any very interesting tools to bring. I could have brought a yellow pad or a pen.
When is it from?
It's from 1995.
Can you show it to us?
So here it is.
Firm contracts and financial structure.
Yes, it's very much about the work that I won the prize for. It sort of summarized my work up to that point. I've done a few things since then, but a lot of it, the stuff is in here.
Okay.
If anybody's interested.
Yeah, of course they are. Was it hard work writing this book?
Well, yes, quite hard work in the sense that the book's different. I'm used to writing articles, papers. A book is obviously a bigger project, and just putting it all together, is challenging.
How long time did it take to write it?
Well, it was based on some lectures I gave, the Clarendon lectures at Oxford University, which I gave in May 1993, and the book came out in October 1995, and I wasn't working on it continuously during that period, so I would say it took about a year.
What brought you to economic science in the first place?
Graduated in mathematics from Cambridge University in 1969, and that was a time of student rebellion in many countries. And so I was thinking, what am I going to do? Well, further study seemed the obvious thing, but in what field? I knew I wasn't destined to be a mathematician, so I was looking around for ways to apply mathematics, and people mentioned economics, so that was one motivation. But the other motivation was that I was quite political at the time. I liked to engage in political arguments with people. I'm still rather argumentative, but I got frustrated because when I had these arguments, the other person would inevitably bring up some economic issue at some point in the argument. And since I knew nothing about economics, I was completely lost at that stage. So I thought, I've got to, find out something about this field. So the combination of things is what led me to economics.
Was it political arguments, or what did you argue about?
Yeah, politics.
Politics.
Yes.
At what point did you realize that you had a groundbreaking discovery?
At what point?
Yeah, in your research.
Well, you never quite realize it. I think getting the Nobel Prize helps you realize that maybe it was okay after all. I felt I wrote a paper with Sanford Grossman in 1986. It was published in 86. We actually wrote it, we started it in 1983, and had produced the unpublished version, but took about 3 years to publish. So that paper I felt was a good one, certainly by my standards. So
why?
Well, I just felt there was a sort of a pretty basic insight there, and which had to do with incomplete contracts and residual control rights. So the whole idea of control being important when the contracts that people write are incomplete, which they often are. So that it was a kind of conceptual breakthrough, I thought. But of course, that's not the same as other people thinking it.
What makes an excellent scientist, do you think?
Well, ultimately it's what they do. I don't know. You can only really. So it's all in the output. But in terms of what characteristics are important, I wouldn't want to generalize. I think probably, well, I'll generalize a little. Okay. So I think probably it's very important to be somewhat ambitious in the questions you ask. So you're never going to do anything really striking if you are focused on just making small additions to the literature, which is tempting because that's a way to get papers published and to advance in your career. But if you want to do something a bit more than that, you have to be willing to tackle large questions. So I think that's one thing. And that may not come that easily. I wouldn't say I started out like that. I think I was, it's something that developed over time with the help of other people, co-authors, very important. And the other thing I would point to is being willing to stick to something, perhaps for years, decades, until, once you've found something that seems important and where you feel you have something to say, then I think it's good to kind of stick with it until you've really got quite far with it. And you have to do that sometimes through thick and thin. So I would say of my own path that the topic I worked on, which is the one I mentioned, incomplete contracts and control, turned out to be harder than I thought. Even after that paper, which I thought was something of a breakthrough, it wasn't as if that was it. It turned out there were many other obstacles to making progress. And sometimes, so I stuck with it, even though, sometimes those obstacles seemed very large, and it would have been quite tempting to kind of walk away and do something else, but I didn't do that. So I think that's also probably an important quality.
To stay with the question.
To be persistent.
Okay.
And to be often, to keep going even when, as I say, there are obstacles, and also what you're doing is not, kind of hot. Because in economics, just as in many other things, I'm sure it's true of other physics and other sciences, and we know it's true in pop music or movies or anything, but it's true even in academic fields. They're fashions, and what you're doing may not be the fashionable thing, and so what do? I think to keep going is probably important, because eventually people may decide what you were doing is actually good after all, even though the attention is somewhere else.
Is there any person that has inspired you in your work?
You mean other economists?
Yeah.
Certainly people who, Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991 and started the field, what economists call the theory of the firm. I followed on in his footsteps, although there's a big distance between the way I approach it and the way he approached it, but I certainly very much admire his contributions. Another person I would pick out is Kenneth Arrow, another Nobel laureate who did amazing things in microeconomic theory, and of course there are others too, and also co-authors have been very important to me.
Okay. Let's talk about your research more. If you were to hire me as your research assistant, I guess were to make a contract about my work to you, what would you think about that, and what should I think about when the contract is made?
Well, I do have research assistants. I have. I don't have much of a contract with them. I think, although I write about contracts, I don't necessarily always write very detailed contracts, because I think in some cases just a handshake or the equivalent is good enough. And I think with a research assistant, that's probably the case, because neither of you is getting that locked into the relationship. So if things don't work out, they can go and find somebody else. You can hire another research assistant. And so I think it's enough to just give them some idea of what you want, and you agree on how much you're going to pay them. Those things are important to get out of the way, so there's no misunderstanding about those. But then you can sort of see how it goes. In contrast, when I had an addition put on my house back in 1996, well, that's when we finally did it, but we wrote a pretty detailed contract with the contractor. And in fact, I described some of this in my book. Even though it came out a little before, I was already in the process of doing it. So I talked about applying the ideas, my ideas, to a contract with someone who's doing some work on your house, in this case quite extensive. So that, I would say, is not like a research assistant. It was important to write something quite detailed.
What brought you into contract theory in the first place?
It was a progression, an evolution. I started off in my thesis being interested in the behavior of firms in situations of uncertainty, and I was particularly interested in work shortly after my thesis. So this was my PhD thesis was 1974. So the next few years I was interested in conflicts between different owners of a firm. So if you think of a publicly traded firm, you know, there are many different shareholders. They're buying and selling shares. At any moment in time, there's a certain group of people who are the shareholders, and a large number of them. They don't necessarily. So a question I was interested in is, what does each of them want the firm to do? And they may not agree about what the firm should be doing. Some of them might want the firm to maximize profit, others might want something else. How do you resolve those conflicts? Over time, I realized that maybe that wasn't the most interesting question. What was more interesting was the conflict between the manager of the firm and the shareholders. And this is part of principal agent theory, which actually this prize, so my co-laureate, Bengt Holmström, has done particularly important work in that area. But so the whole idea that the manager of a firm, the CEO, the board of the firm, might have different objectives from the shareholders, and how do the shareholders design incentives to bring management sort of into line with their wishes. I thought that was sort of more interesting than the conflict among different shareholders. But that led me eventually to examine, or should I say re-examine, this basic question of what is a firm and what determines, so this is now something a little different, which is what determines the set of activities under this particular manager. So why, you know, if you have firm A here with a manager and shareholders, and firm B with a manager and shareholders, would it make any difference if those two firms merged and became a single firm? Or why don't they? Why do we have two firms rather than one, or maybe 10? And this is the question that Ronald Coase first raised, which is, why do we see so many activities taking place inside firms rather than in the marketplace? So that's, and to answer that question, so I got interested in that, trying to do something a little more formal than what Coase had done. And also another, Oliver Williamson has also worked on this, and he's another Nobel laureate. He won in 2009. So they had important things to say, but they were rather informal by the standards of an economic theorist like myself. So I wanted to do something a bit more formal, and I realized that to tackle that question, one had to really understand contracts and the limits of contracts. So that's roughly how I got into it, yeah.
Do you have any advice to a young person who is interested in science? Like, what should you do to become a Nobel laureate?
Try to be ambitious in the questions you're asking. I think if you have, I mean, the secret is often a good question. And so, you know, you should try to ask something big, Sometimes it may be something that somebody has asked, but it doesn't have to be brand new, but maybe you're going to, you think, well, there's some answers to that big question, but I don't think they're entirely satisfactory, so then you might work more on those, on trying to provide better answers.
If you look at the world today, what do you think is the most important economic issue?
You know, there's still countries that are very poor, and you know, so a big question is going to be, how do they become richer? We've seen that it's certainly possible. Look at China, extraordinary success story in terms of just the economics. So could you see that kind of development happening in Africa? So these are probably the world's biggest questions, I would say. But then if we focus on the more advanced countries, of course we're seeing a lot of political dissatisfaction as some people feel left behind as a result of globalization or automation. And I guess, you know, the question is, how are we going to deal with that? You know, worst case scenario, it leads to a lot of political unrest and maybe even the sort of breakup of the political system, and that would be the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that we find some way to make these people less dissatisfied, and so that we can sort of, things can return to being a bit more harmonious.
You had an election in the United States.
Yeah.
What do you think of Mr. Trump and his view of science?
I've spoken about this. I'm not a supporter of Mr. Trump in any way. Okay. What he says scares me. Both economics and the rest of him, actually. I think he's encouraged expressions of racism in the United States, and that's very worrying, and I think really a terrible thing.
Let's get back to science then.
Yeah.
What is a normal day at work for you before you get the information about the prize?
A normal day?
Yeah.
A normal day would be very normal. I mean, it would be like many other people's days. I get up, sometimes, you know, fairly early. How early? Well, you know, I'm usually up by around 6:30. It's not that early, but and I read the newspaper just to keep up with what's going on in the world. Have breakfast, shower, go to work. I tend to I like to work in my office. I work better there really than at home. So obviously during the Harvard semester, I have various obligations, teaching,
so you meet students,
seeing students, talking to students about their research, going to seminars, some of which are given by students. We have lunches, brown bag lunches for our PhD students who present work in progress. So there's you know, a certain number of the days of the week I will have those kinds of obligations, office hours. But then I also have a number of hours during the week when I can just get on with my own work. I tend to do that in my office, sit at my desk with a yellow pad and a pencil or pen and try to make some progress on some ideas. But then there's also a lot of other stuff like writing letters of recommendation, or you know, people ask you for some other institution is considering promoting somebody. What do I think about that? So there's a lot of stuff like that as well.
What's the best part of your work?
The best part? Yeah. Well, the best part would be the research when I can get to it. Yeah.
Do you work alone mostly, or together with others?
Usually with co-authors. I think certainly over the years in economics there's more and more co-authored work, and I'm no exception to that. So I usually have at least one co-author, usually one.
Bengt Holmström, or?
Well, I've written a couple of papers with Bengt, but he's not my most frequent co-author,
Okay.
but I have, yes.
Yeah. And a last question. Now I talked a lot about your research and career, and that's very interesting. But what is important in life for you more than that?
Well, family is tremendously important. I spend a lot of time with my family, my wife, but also my two sons. And one of my sons, my oldest son, who's married with two children, we're very, very lucky that they live very close to us, just 2 miles away. Okay. So we see a lot of them. So I would say that's, you know, hugely important. But I also like to do, you didn't ask about my hobbies, but I like swimming. I like eating, as I think we said. I like drinking a nice glass of wine. Right. I used to be a big tennis fan. I still am. I like to watch tennis on television. I'm a pretty bad player, but I don't play so much anymore. My younger son is quite good, actually. What else? I like very much movies or plays or music. I love music, and I'm playing the piano actually again after a break of several decades. But I'm getting back to the piano. I have a very good teacher, and so that's very important to me.
That sounds very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.